Hello, this is Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, and you're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. Today's programme is entitled The History of Philosophy in Less Than an Hour. I'm here with Nigel Warburton. His most recent book is A Little History of Philosophy, and Jane O'Grady, who's teaching a course on the history of philosophy at the London School of Philosophy. Nigel's book, as the name suggests, is an introduction to the history of philosophy, and I think it would make a great introduction to anybody who can read properly. So first, before we get into the history of philosophy, I just want to ask Nigel a couple of questions about the book. First, Nigel, could you tell us, why did you use the format of 40 individual philosophers?
OK, well, the book, A Little History of Philosophy, is in the same vein as a bestseller that emerged from the 1930s, unbelievably, which was Ernst Gombrich's A Little History of the World. He wrote it in 1935 in 6 weeks, and that also has 40 chapters, incidentally.
Oh, right.
It was published in German in 1936, banned after the Anschluss, and didn't see the light of day again until an English translation very late in Gombrich's life at the end of the last century.
Well,
Yale University Press published it, and they then have spawned a series from it. David Crystal did a little book of language, and mine, A Little History of Philosophy, is the third in the series.
OK. What are the criteria for your choice of which philosophers to include, or which to omit, even?
Well, I was writing with a brief to write in a way that would be intelligible to an intelligent 14-year-old and not patronising to an adult reader, which is quite a difficult brief to start with. So I was looking to find philosophers who I think are genuinely important, who are interesting, and would lend themselves to this kind of treatment, so they weren't incredibly technical writers necessarily, or their philosophy could be summarised. So I follow this arc from Socrates through to Peter Singer, the contemporary Australian philosopher.
OK, I don't think we're going to be able to cover all of them, but we're going to divide the history of philosophy into 3 sections: the ancient world to Descartes to probably Nietzsche, and Nietzsche to now, and hopefully we'll be able to say a little bit about each section. So first we're going to start with the ancient world, really, which is Socrates, Aristotle, maybe all the way up to Augustine, Aquinas, these sort of things. But I want to ask you, Jane, who is your favourite or most significant philosopher from this period, the classical, classical period means probably about 500 years BC in Greece, coming up to about 300.
Well, I'd like to say 2 and cheat. I mean, they're fairly obvious ones, Plato and Augustine.
Right. They're at opposite end of the time scale that we're talking about here. So why would you say that they're significant for the history of philosophy?
Well, Plato, I mean, it's very, very famously said that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. And he did, in fact, he was key at asking the most important questions and sort of setting up all the questions that were going to be asked for the next, that are still being asked.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, for instance, how is it possible that we can call by the same name things that are completely different? Dog, look at all the different sort of dogs. Red, look at all the different shades of red. And this, which we now call the problem of universals, he answered with his very famous theory of what used to be called the ideas and is now called the forms. And it's, as with so many things in philosophy, philosophers say very silly things in a way. It's clearly absurd, and yet it's got something in it that has kept people absolutely riveted for centuries. OK,
Nigel, what about you? Would you agree that Plato is the most significant?
Well, Plato is probably the best writer. He's an amazing writer. He recorded dialogues or created these literary interpretations of what Socrates allegedly said to people in the marketplace. I mean, my favourite philosopher of this period is actually Socrates.
OK, let me just give the link. Yeah, the link here is that Socrates went around the Athenian marketplace asking awkward philosophical questions of the nobles, and Plato was his pupil, and he wrote down allegedly Socrates' dialogues with these people in what are called the dialogues. So why do you prefer Socrates over Plato, please, Nigel?
Well, there's several reasons, but I think philosophy really begins with Socrates. This is somebody who is asking difficult questions. He's not taking anything for granted. Now, that could just be really irritating, and it was irritating. He saw himself as a gadfly, a kind of horsefly, biting the great horse that is Athens and stirring it. And the point was...
So he's a political agitator.
Well, he was a political agitator. He was also... put to death, possibly because of political involvement and I mean, allegedly for corrupting the youth of Athens and worshipping false gods. But for me, the essence of what Socrates is doing is refusing to take truth by authority and examining what people really know and discovering in the process that he was wiser than anybody else around him. This is what the Delphic oracle allegedly said, the wisest man in Athens. Who is it? It's Socrates. Socrates wouldn't believe it. But then he came to realise that other people profess to know things, like a soldier will know what courage is, or somebody else will know about what moral goodness is, they think. But under questioning, they collapse.
Yeah.
So what he's doing is showing the limits of wisdom, the limits of knowledge, and recognising his own limitation, that kind of humility, as well as the arrogance of the challenging, is the essence of philosophy for me.
And I think also he sets up a form of philosophical argument in which, a question is asked, what is, let's say, knowledge or courage? And then people barge in and say, oh, it's this, it's that. And he immediately offers counter-examples, examples which actually are contrary to the definition. And then people have to think, oh, actually, I can't be right. And then they start coming up with new things. And what's great about the dialogues that Plato records of Socrates arguing with people is that actually they always end inconclusively.
And it's that process of questioning dialogue which is crucial to philosophy. It may not be apparent. There's this vision of a philosopher as somebody with a long beard sitting in an ivory tower conjuring up ideas from their mind. But actually, in reality, almost every philosopher gets their ideas, refines their ideas in a social context through having their views challenged and refuted in some cases, and then they come back with a better version.
The only trouble that I'd say about Plato's dialogues is that there are some of them that are frightfully irritating in the way that people sort of say, Socrates, who is Plato's mouthpiece, will say something, and everyone's saying sort of, yes, Socrates, no, Socrates, 3 bags full, like Socrates. It's very annoying. You feel actually he could be challenged more.
Not by his pupil who wrote down his dialogues.
No, I suspect the real Socrates didn't get such nice answers coming back all the time.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, though, I mean, it seems to me from what you said that the important thing is not the answers that he gave necessarily, but the method he used, or the persistent doggedness he undertook to explore these questions.
Well, it's also that he was asking the central question. For him, the central question is, how should we live?
Okay.
And that relates to our view of what the nature of reality is, which was a central question for him as well.
So that's your central philosophical question, is
that's
how
the most basic question, how should we live? And that takes in metaphysics, the nature of reality, because if there's a God, we might behave differently from if there isn't. If we live in a world which is somehow illusory, then we need to find a better way of getting at the truth than the one we have.
But I think actually that maybe the key question is, what is the truth? Both in general as a huge metaphysical thing, and also what is the truth in a particular situation and about a particular subject, and also how can we know it? I think there's always that thing in philosophy which is so undercutting and brilliant, which is, okay, you think this is what the case is, but actually, how can you be sure? How can you know? It's always that question of, well, you can't be sure. There's appearance and reality, and how do you get hold of reality?
But it's also the spirit of thinking. He said the unexamined life isn't worth living.
Okay, who said
for a human
that,
being.
Plato or Socrates?
Well, Socrates is reputedly said it, and the idea is, for a human being, the unexamined life isn't worth living. It's okay for cattle. They don't have the capacity for thinking about, reflecting on the nature of their lives, but human beings have that capacity, and we get this one opportunity to think about how things really are. If we take things on trust, if we don't really think about them, we end up just parroting other people's views.
Okay, so this is the start of philosophy, is the beginning of this philosophical questioning method. It's the beginning of asking all the big questions, and especially ethics and metaphysics, the nature of reality, you would say. And would you say that it's those two areas that have really consumed philosophy in the West since Socrates, or are there other areas that have come into play since then? Either of you?
Well, obviously, Another major area of philosophy is aesthetics, judgments about beauty, judgments about art.
Okay.
But traditionally, metaphysics, ethics and political philosophy and aesthetics are the main focus of philosophy. But that encompasses just about any reflective question you can ask. The nature of reality takes in what has become science, takes in all kinds of philosophy of religion as well. It's such a general idea that it doesn't really refine the subject matter very much.
Okay.
Yes, because I think that's one of the things. It's very much sort of up for grabs. What is the nature of reality? Especially with the pre-Socratics, the people before Socrates, and continuously. You know, reality could be what we now call mental, it could be, or spiritual, it could be physical, it could be anything. There's always that possibility that you're not, you're starting in the middle of nowhere, in an abyss.
Okay, well, we're going to be in the middle of the philosophical abyss in a few minutes when we sort of move it on from the classical period to the early modern period, I suppose. But right now we're going to listen to Alan Stewart, who's a London-based Scottish singer-songwriter, and he's playing a couple of songs with us tonight. If you like the next song, his website is alanstewartmusic.com, and I think this is called Time Waits for No Man?
No Man.
Okay, take it away.
Time waits for no one, baby. Don't wait for me. Don't wait for you. Don't wait for your skin. Don't wait for your hair. Time's got no patience. They really don't care. You're pushing a deal, it's all work, it's no play. You know it's gonna take some time. Just remember, time's the bottom line. Every minute, every day, time's gonna make you pay. At a moment in the week, it ain't got time to speak. At an hour in the month, you're gonna hit that crunch, 'cause time waits for no one, baby blue. Time waits for no one, baby blue. Like a hurricane blowing, time's after you. Wait for the sun, don't wait for the rain. Time's got an attitude, it's gonna bring you pain. And if you're thinking of taking a moment just to try and work things out, just remember, time's got the cloud. Go sail down the river, let your feelings flow. Sail down the river, let it go. Just love every moment, feel every thrill. 'Cause time is ticking, it won't stay still. Time waits for no one, baby blue. Like a sprinter at a racetrack, time's timing you. From the starter's gun to the final straight, time's moving you on, it can't be late. Every minute, every day, time's gonna make you pay. At a moment in the week, ain't got time to speak. At an hour in the month, you're gonna hit that crunch, 'cause time waits for no one, baby blue. Time waits for no one. Baby blue. Baby blue.
Oh, thanks, Alan. That was Alan Stewart with Time Waits for No Man, and it's alanstewartmusic.com. This is Grant Bartley on the Philosophy Now radio show. We're talking a little bit about aspects from the history of philosophy. I'm here with Nigel Warburton, who's written a little history of philosophy, which is out now, and Jane O'Grady, who's teaching a history of philosophy at the London School of Philosophy. We've talked a bit about how the Western idea of philosophy got started in Greece with the Socratic method of questioning and the topics of ethics, which is how to live, and metaphysics, which is what is the nature of reality. We're going to move on to what is called the beginning of the modern period of philosophy, which starts with René Descartes in, I think, the 16th century in France. Either of you, I just want to ask, why is René Descartes called the father of Western philosophy? What did he do that was so new and seminal, and why did he do it? And why did he need to take this philosophical break from the past?
Well, the thing about Descartes is that between Socrates and Descartes, there were a lot of medieval philosophers who tended to the view that whatever Aristotle said was true. Right. This is a crude, version of
that's
history.
Called the Scholastic period.
So, so there's a lot of interpretative work that doesn't involve the same. This is a caricature, but it didn't involve the same kind of radical starting again. Descartes starts thinking, well, what can I know for certain? He doesn't say, what did Aristotle say was the truth was. He starts thinking, what can I know for certain?
So he wanted a clean break. Yeah?
And he says that, in fact, if you take the authority of Aristotle and Plato, you're just doing history. You're not doing philosophy. Right. I mean, you have to... And there's a wonderful bit where he says... that everyone thinks that they're intelligent. Everyone thinks that they've got enough common sense. They don't envy anybody else for that. Yeah. And in a way, he's being satirical. But in another way, I think he's saying, actually, if we really concentrate and use our reason, yes, we can get at truth. We don't need these mediators. And it's funny, of course, he was a Catholic, but in a way, he's following that Protestant line of saying we don't need the big guys, the men in dresses, between us and truth.
Mm-hmm. So what was new about what he was doing?
Well, it wasn't very new. He was actually resurrecting a certain kind of sceptical argument that was popular in the ancient world.
Okay.
So he was saying, what can I know for certain? Do I trust the evidence of my senses? They sometimes deceive me. You shouldn't ever trust something that deceives you. So you can't be sure that, for instance, what you see in front of you is really there. You could just about be mistaken. So he came up with this notion that we now call Cartesian doubt. It's an extreme sceptical method, not because he wanted to end up with this position of uncertainty, which some sceptical philosophers in the past were happy with. Yeah. He wanted to preempt that. He wanted to take the strongest sceptical arguments and show that you could still get beyond them and prove something for certain.
Yeah.
So I think also it was very important that he redrew the boundaries of what counts as the mental and the physical. He actually sort of scooped into the mental, not just the sort of intellectual type stuff, the spiritual stuff, but also things like sensations and willing and things that before. So he rewrote those boundaries. And I think, therefore, I am is so important. I mean, people at the time said, why can't you say ambulo ergo sum, I walk, therefore I am? Aldous Huxley said, why can't you say caco ergo sum, I shit, therefore I am? The point is that all those things you could dream about doing or hallucinate doing. But it's your actual thinking, you're hallucinating, you're being conscious, that is the crux of the thing. It shows that you at least must exist in some form.
Whatever else is true, there must be
whatever
thought,
else is true,
yeah?
and you might not actually be existing as a body. I mean, once in taking drugs, I had that feeling. Maybe nothing exists, but I couldn't escape myself. I went ticking and tocking through that experience,
Okay.
and I was worried that I had no body, that I was
Saved by
in an
René
abyss.
Descartes.
But the trouble is, you still don't know what you are.
Yeah.
You just get there is something, and whatever it is.
That's true.
And then he has to bring in God
Yeah.
to get it.
Well,
to get
he's a
beyond
good
that,
Catholic,
so.
isn't he? But is it true that he redivided the philosophical landscape and reset it to zero or something like that?
Well, the way that Descartes is influential in philosophy is typically now not so much with his sceptical arguments, but with the clear division between mind and body, which he thought interacted. Naively, he thought through the pineal gland, but his point was that there is this physical stuff and there's this mental stuff, and they're very, very different. And that's a view that a lot of religious people still hold today.
Yeah. Okay,
Not
but
just religious people, by the way. I really object to that.
Well, mostly religious people.
I'm not religious, and I know that.
okay. Look, stop bickering.
I don't want to arguing from a single case
Ne-
at school, not bickering.
Next, apart from Descartes, I mean, which other philosophers do you admire, or whose thoughts from this period do you like?
My favourite philosopher of all time, probably Socrates aside, is David Hume, the great
Okay.
18th century Scot, who was a major figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, which was, many people think, the centre of the Enlightenment, actually. It's a really interesting phenomenon in Edinburgh. And for me, the heart of his philosophy is his rigorous arguments about religion. When he was writing at a time where it was actually quite dangerous to be an atheist, he wasn't openly an atheist, but he was examining the arguments that theologians used and showing the flaws in the arguments that were used. So, for instance, with the argument from design, the idea that you can look around you and see evidence of intelligent making in, for instance, a human eye. The human eye seems to be designed for a purpose. Isn't that a bit like a clockwork thing put together by a clever divine clockwork
the
maker?
divine watchmaker.
Yeah, well, he says, well, look at the evidence. A wise person proportions their beliefs to the evidence available. It's probably just as likely that a benevolent God made something like that a team of gods made it. Why not a team of lesser gods making it?
Or
I mean, if you think about human
I think he also
creations-
said, like, why not have God try... This was like the final result of like several million trials or something.
Yeah, it could have been that. He came up with a kind of prototype of evolutionary theory as well. And he came up with a range of alternative explanations, each of which was just as probable as the idea that a benevolent God had made
Okay.
this thing.
I think also what's important about him is he called himself a mitigated. He said that he went in for mitigated skepticism, and he is a skeptic. He dismantles everything, even the self. He says is actually there isn't such a thing as the self. We're just sort of drifting sensations and perceptions and so on. But at the same time, he's deeply humane and. In a way, you could say that he more than is humane, but he's as much the father of modern philosophy, if not more than Descartes, because he is demoting reason. He's saying, look, actually, animals have reason just as much as us. He's
Surely not true.
almost Darwinian.
Surely animals don't have reason.
Well,
languages, abstract languages, necessary.
I quite
reason,
agree with
right?
you. I quite agree with you. And in one way, of course, he knows that. But he thinks that the animals like us, he has a very strange idea about causation, are sort of driven to make sort of causal connections. They act as if what's happened before is going to happen again.
Okay.
So I think the key is that he sees us as extensive. Sorry, we're part of the natural world. That's what he's saying. We're part of the natural world, and actually, reason is the slave of the passions, as he put it. He's not, although he's
What
a
does that
philosopher.
mean?
Well, it means that what your desires are is given by your emotional feelings. It's not that reason solves everything. There's a
Right.
picture of humanity where your logical part is in complete control, but that's not what he's saying.
But I think that's partly, he's saying that in the context of morality. He's saying that actually what drives morality is, and passions then didn't mean, it meant sort of more emotions, not the sort of strong sort of stuff that we think of
But
passions as
beware
being.
of mistranslations of old
Yeah,
texts,
yeah,
right?
exactly. But he's thinking that morality should be driven by, and is driven, in fact, by compassion,
But I'm,
not reason.
I'm
So
interested,
he's-
both of you. Why are these arguments, you think, so interesting or central to the history of philosophy? Because they seem quite peripheral arguments compared
What, arguments
to...
about the existence of God?
Well, it could be taken as peripheral if you want to say...
Compared to what?
Compared to, how can I be happy, or what is the nature of reality?
Well, he
those are
deals with both
questions-
of those too.
Yeah.
Those are questions he definitely deals with. But
Yeah.
apart from that, I mean, one of the things that makes him very endearing is not just that his personality is interesting, but he was a great writer.
Yeah.
And he wrote the treatise, his first book, and it famously fell dead born from the press. Nobody was interested in it. And rather than arrogantly just saying, well, that's their problem, he took it upon himself to rewrite it in a style that was more accessible to the general reader. And he also wrote essays which were deliberately popular essays. Which
And
is
he's
stylish.
funny as well.
Yeah.
He's funny.
Well, there you go. Budding philosophers, be funny in your writing. Okay. Any other philosophers from let's say, René Descartes onwards till about the 20th century that you either of you'd want to single out for special acclaim?
Nietzsche?
Nietzsche. Well, let's perhaps do Nietzsche later. What about, I don't know, there's Kant, there's Schopenhauer, Hegel. None of these guys really...
I prefer Rousseau, actually, to those.
Rousseau.
Rousseau is a fascinating character.
Okay.
Completely paranoid, but in his challenging of the preconceptions of his age, where in the...
Rousseau was about what date was he living?
Well, he was
18th century.
yeah, he was alive.
France,
he was
yeah.
he actually met and fell out with David Hume. They're both 18th century. In the 1760s, he was brought to England by David Hume, and they had a big squabble that's written about brilliantly in a book called Rousseau's Dog by David Edmonds.
Okay, so what does Rousseau think? He's a philosopher of freedom, I think. Is that true?
What does Rousseau think? Is
Yeah.
a big question.
Yeah.
One of the things he felt was that you couldn't take for granted that civilization was progress.
No.
Many of the
Why
people-
did he think that?
I mean,
I mean, people always credit that term "noble savage" to Rousseau,
Okay.
and actually he never used it, apparently. But he was very keen on the idea that somehow the corruption, almost the sort of the original sin, was when somebody enclosed a plot of ground. Somebody actually, the divisiveness of society in which there's competition and possession, and that was what estranged people from one another and led to sort of affectation and getting away from the sort of simplicity of what he thought to be the natural man.
But if we started off so great, then why did we move to civilization? But anyway, that's...
Well, that's a good point. He
well, for
thinks...
protection. I mean, it's very difficult when you're competing for resources not to get into difficult situations with other people competing for resources.
Sure,
but for me, Rousseau isn't just the political philosopher, which he's remembered for. He was also a philosopher of education. He wrote Emile, which was he was an early advocate of breastfeeding, which was quite a radical position to take in the 18th century.
Okay.
But he was also an early autobiographer. I mean, his confessions are fascinating.
Oh, yeah, sadomasochistic, I believe.
Well, that's the one
Yeah.
bit that people quote, but this is a
But he
symptom of his honesty, in a sense, that he wanted to show you everything. And to the extent that when you'd read his confessions, you were supposed to know two people really well. That's more than most people go through life knowing. They usually know quite a lot about one person, but this reveals something about
you
another
both talked about two post-Enlightenment or post-Enlightenment philosophers. This is when they wanted to exalt reason over tradition, I suppose.
Well, yes and no, because what's interesting about Rousseau and Hume is that actually, they are... Hume is part of the Scottish Enlightenment. Rousseau is obviously enlightened, but at the same time they're so keen on the emotions. They're so keen, the emotions dethroning reason.
Okay.
And Rousseau, in fact, is so keen on... Well, in one way interestingly enough, when he writes about the natural man in Discourse on Inequality, he actually thinks that the natural man, the man who hasn't been sort of corrupted by society, wouldn't have many emotions. Because he wouldn't need them. He wouldn't... I think he rather dismissed emotions as being a bit womanish, the way...
Emotions are dysfunctional feelings. Or
Yes,
something.
yes. But at the same...
That's not the whole of Rousseau. I mean, obviously,
No.
his thoughts on democracy and the role of discerning what the common good is and what you do with people who don't fall into line they should be forced to be free. This was quite an interesting consequence of his philosophy. And he was actually a philosopher who influenced Karl Marx.
Okay.
This idea of trying to discern what is for the common good.
Freedom.
Human beings are fundamentally equal, that we have to, we're born free but everywhere in chains. This is something that resonated for Marx and was very important for him.
So you both like these people because they prefigure the modern mind, is that right?
No, the point about reading philosophers of the past is that they make you think.
Okay.
So I love philosophers who stimulate you to think, even if you don't agree with them. You can think their views are absurd, but at least you know what they said. There are lines there which are profound, there are lines there which seem banal, but the philosophers that I love are philosophers who make the reader do philosophy.
Okay, so even if you don't agree, you're going to learn something.
Well, even
about
more
how
so
to
if you don't
think,
agree,
or-
because you clarify what your own thoughts are, which I think is the main reason for studying philosophy at all. It's not just learning stuff from the museum of the history of the past.
So which philosophy do you most disagree with in your book, Nigel? And
That's an interesting question. I actually left out one of the ones I most disagree with. I left Heidegger out.
Okay.
Not least because he was clearly a Nazi, literally a Nazi, but because his style of writing was so obscure that I felt there was something pseudo-profound about his writing. There are people who will say, no, you have to persevere. There really is something incredibly important there. But I'm sceptical, actually, and I think it's a great fault in him, not just that he was a Nazi, and I didn't want to endorse a Nazi, but that he was such a terrible, terrible communicator.
Okay, Jane, what about when you're teaching the history of philosophy, you presumably have to teach a lot of people that you disagree with. Who do you sort of most disagree with?
Oh, God.
Well, who really gets your goat?
Did you mean God?
Well, Heidegger... I didn't mean God. But I quite agree with you. Heidegger, of course, one shouldn't be ad hominem. In other words, judge people by their lives, judge philosophers by their lives. But I agree with Nietzsche that philosophy is a sort of memoir. And I think it is indicative that somebody who was a Nazi, who was able to sort of think he was good and think he was in touch with nature while allowing these sort of frightful things to go on, should write in such an obscure, sort of bombastic way.
Okay, that was Heidegger is from the 20th century, and are we going to take another break for Alan to give us some Sunday dreaming, and then we're going to talk a bit about more recent philosophers?
Sunday morning, living in another world. Clear blue sky, smile from a beautiful girl. I don't ask no questions, I dream, don't tell no lie. Beautiful girl staring up at a clear blue sky. Well, I can't understand this dream, feels so familiar. I'm gonna hang right in, right to the end. I ain't gonna wake up Sunday dreaming, and it feels so fine. I ain't gonna wake up. I'm Sunday dreaming, and it feels so fine. It's so fine. Sunday ain't coming. Monday, away. But I wonder, should I make a move? I keep my eyes shut tight. Maybe this dream come true. I don't ask no questions, dream. Don't tell no lies. Beautiful. Staring up at a clear blue sky. Well, I can't understand why this dream feels so familiar. I'm gonna hang right in, right to the end. I ain't gonna wake up. I'm Sunday dreaming. So fine, I ain't gonna wake up. I'm Sunday dreaming, and it feels so fine, like a fish on the line. Monday ain't coming, Sunday's here to stay.
Thanks, Alan. That was Sunday Dreaming. If you like Alan's music, you can find more info and stuff on alanstewartmusic.com. And I'm Grant Bartley. You're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. I'm here with Nigel Warburton and Jane O'Grady, and we're talking a little about prominent figures from the history of philosophy. We've seen the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece, and we've seen a bit of development through the Descartes and the Enlightenment. Now we're just going to talk a bit about the 20th century and what's been happening there. The most prominent figure at the beginning of which period was Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, this is a question for both of you. With the proclamation of the death of God at the beginning of the 20th century, Nietzsche could be said to herald the modern mind. What are modern, recent 20th century philosophy's questions, and how did Nietzsche start them, and that sort of thing?
Well, I think Nietzsche was interestingly sort of Darwinian, almost in the way that he, and also Hegelian. I mean, Hegel was a stuffy old bore, but and Nietzsche probably wouldn't have liked him, and he was a bit sort of system building, and Nietzsche hated systems.
Hegel was an 18th century German philosopher.
Yes, Hegel was an 19th century, but what Nietzsche kept thinking about was the position of human beings in life and in history. And he thought that truth wasn't necessarily something that they were aiming for, that actually sometimes error was useful.
Okay, so that's really the birth of postmodernism, would you say?
Well, yes, although, I mean, I hasten to say that it would be ridiculous to say that Nietzsche wasn't after truth himself. I mean, first of all, not just because he was doing philosophy, but because he was so sort of screwed up with truth that he was always scorpioning round on himself and actually sort of biting his own views.
Give me an example, like what would he?
Well, for instance, I mean, he says he in his genealogy of morals. So that's one of the things he's doing. He's not just saying, let's look at morality as if it's sort of suspended in midair and came from nowhere. He's saying, how did morality begin, for goodness sake? And so what he says is, well, actually, how it began is that we had these lovely blonde, beautiful heroes who were ruthless and vile, and yet at the same time admirable for him, and they were completely uncompassionate, completely sort of bashing people around, raping them, etc.
Uh-huh.
And the only way that the weak could get back at them was to say that compassion was very, very important, and that was the virtue, and that these people had behaved frightfully badly. And so these people, the lower people, who he said, among whom were the Jews, but he included the Christians, of course, were full of ressentiment. For some reason he used the French word, resentment.
Okay.
And they were getting back at the big guys. But then he scorpions back on himself by saying, but of course the Jews are so clever, and Christianity was so clever as well, doing this, making compassion this big deal so that people would behave well. So, I mean, he's always sort of dismantling himself as well as everything else.
There's a fantastic passage in Beyond Good and Evil where Nietzsche diagnoses philosophers. It talks about the prejudices of philosophers and says, where do the philosophical ideas come from? Take a philosopher like Kant. By the power of reason, he supposedly churns through with his logic and comes out with conclusions about how people ought to obey the moral law. But
another
also,
18th century German philosopher.
If you look at him closely, I mean, he's a certain kind of Christian thinker. What a surprise that the power of reason takes him exactly to the position that he would have been in where he started. Just to rationalises his prejudices.
Well, I think that's
there's
what
a sense in which all
everybody
philosophers
does, right?
Well, that wasn't obvious to everybody.
But he tries not to. Nietzsche tries not to.
He's giving a psychological analysis of where philosophers get their ideas from. It's not as if we are just rationally arriving at truth like some kind of machine. There is a drive that's an inner desire. I mean, he says it's often a sexual desire as well. That he was
it's a will for power. Will to power, I think, is the phrase.
Well, the trouble with the will to power, most of the stuff about the will to power comes from his sister's rehashing of his notebooks. So it's quite difficult to
see what was the original Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's lots of figures that listeners would have heard of from the 20th century, like Sartre and Wittgenstein, I suppose. I mean, I think existentialism is probably something that we ought to have a quick look at. Sartre, why is he famous?
Well, he was a major figure of the 20th century, not just as a philosopher, but as a novelist, a playwright. He even wrote a screenplay for a film about Freud that wasn't made. But he was a political spokesman. He was on the barricades in the 60s. I mean, he was a major figure. But his existentialism made him famous.
Okay.
He didn't like being called.
What did it say?
Well, crudely, he begins from the idea that human beings have no nature. There's no God to give us nature.
Right.
And we're not part of the natural world in a straightforward way. We actually are fundamentally free, and we create our own natures, each of us. And for him, we act as if the whole of humanity is watching us. So when I decide to do something, that's not just a choice for me. If I'm sincere, I'm saying, through my actions, this is what all human beings ought to be like. This is the anguish of freedom.
So he substituted humanity for God in the moral look.
Well, he thinks that human beings have a desire to become like God, which would be to become like something which is both free and also has an essential essence. But actually, he's saying for human beings, existence precedes essence. That is, we first of all exist and then define what we are through what we do with our lives. But he's a great philosopher for getting at people who make excuses, because he thinks that most of the time, most of us are in what he would call bad faith, a certain kind of flight from freedom. We deny the choices that are available to us because it's more convenient to live this life off the shelf, as it were. But actually, all of us are fundamentally free. We can't do whatever we want to do, and we have our facticity, the things about our lives which we can't change, like who our parents were and how tall we were and so on. But we can change the attitude that we have to those things. He felt we're responsible even for our emotions.
Yes, exactly. He thinks we can even choose our emotions. He's very, very strict about that, and he would be against all this sort of weepy American stuff. And so, so he actually thinks that our emotions are a way we magically transform the world. It's a duplicity in us. It's a dishonesty.
He's got too extreme a view of human freedom, don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, he was. I mean, many of his ideas about freedom were crystallised in occupied Paris. So, what was most important there was freedom. Everybody was obsessed with freedom.
I think also he's a frightful old misogynist, Sartre, and I think he takes it very much from a male point of view, and therefore he doesn't realise that actually all this idea about being able to choose yourself and so on. Men can do that much more easily. Women are embodied as far as men are
But
concerned.
Simone de Beauvoir, his longtime partner, wrote about this in The Second Sex.
Yeah,
and talked
so
about
he was with a
it being a decision to be a
radical
woman.
feminist. So.
Yes, but she
It seems to
betrayed
change
her
it.
radical feminism.
What,
By-
by
but- by
shacking up with Sartre?
Well, no, not by shacking up with him, but by compromising all the time. If he slept with a woman, she'd try and bustle in there as well. And I don't think it was out of sort of sheer desire for the woman. I think she wanted to always sort of keep a check on him, and yet she
That's
surrendered
quite a
to
harsh
him.
judgment on Simone de Beauvoir's life, I think.
Yeah. Well, she was very... OK, we haven't really mentioned any women philosophers. Why don't we say something about Simone de Beauvoir right now? What influence did she have on the 20th century as a philosopher?
Well, partly through Sartre, because actually he didn't give her enough credit. I mean, she read and edited everything that he wrote.
Mm-hmm.
She was incredibly helpful to
But
him.
in her own right, she wrote The Second Sex, which I'm sure is a very influential feminist text. As an
Well, she was a novelist and playwright as well. You know,
Yeah.
she's a literary figure like Sartre was, and not bound like Sartre, not bound by the expectations that you just do one thing. I mean, she chose to write in many different genres.
Okay.
But I mean, she's important as an early feminist. But there are philosophers that predate her who could justifiably be called feminists, including John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century utilitarian philosopher who wrote the book The Subjection of Women.
OK, look, we're really running out of time, so I've got a couple of questions, just general questions. Do you think there's a pattern or a trajectory to the history of Western philosophy, and if so, what is it?
I'm not Hegelian. I don't think there's some inevitable unfolding of history in a particular pattern. I think there are lots of people called philosophers. What I think is happening is that everybody who thinks deeply about questions about the nature of reality is themselves a philosopher. We are all philosophers when we ask ourselves questions like, does God exist? How should I live? What's right and wrong? That makes everybody a philosopher.
I guess what I'm asking, one of the things I'm asking is, has philosophy learnt anything over this long process of 2,000
Philosophy isn't a person,
years?
it doesn't have a consciousness.
You don't think... I mean, but sure, physics improves, biology improves within parameters, so can't philosophy have said to learn...
Well, philosophy's history gets bigger.
And I think it's learnt too that language.
ideas.
I think it's learnt about the importance of language. Philosophers used to think that language was transparent. You could just sort of look through language at the world. They realised, partly with Nietzsche, then with Wittgenstein, that actually language itself has a huge position in the way we actually conceive things and perceive things.
Well, it's the lens through which we see the world, so we better know how it's focusing our view, right?
Well, sometimes it is a bit clouded by woolly language, by people who pretend to be profound but are actually quite shallow, but take people in with a kind of jargon that seems incredibly complex and deep but actually is superficial and meaningless.
Okay, so my last question, I guess, is where do you think philosophy is going to go from now? What's it heading towards? What's it trying to solve?
Well, I hope that there's a book just been written recently, which is a compilation of essays. It's called The Waning of Materialism. I hope that this ridiculous sort of scientising of everything is going to cease.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're just going back to the basic philosophical question of how should we live, and a lot of the philosophical debate that's going on is outside of the academy. There are people who genuinely want to answer questions about how society ought to be organised, how people should behave towards each other, and they're actually engaging with philosophers, but in a popular space, not in a philosophy lecture or in a university.
Okay, and that's a good point to say. Well, I've been speaking to Nigel, who you just heard, and his book is A Little History of Philosophy, but I know you've got like podcasts and websites and stuff, so do you want to say a little bit about that, Nigel?
Well, with David Edmonds, I make this podcast, Philosophy Bites, which we release every fortnight free on the internet, www.philosophybites.com, or probably easier to get it on iTunes.
Right.
And I'm also involved with other podcasts, but that's probably the main one.
Okay, and what's your website, nigelwarburton.com?
I do have that one. Or there's a little historyofphilosophy.com if you want to find out about that.
That's the book, guys.
virtualphilosopher.com.
The History of Philosophy in 40 Essential Western Philosophers. And Jane, you're teaching the history of philosophy, but you've also got a course on the philosophy of love. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, that's part of my sort of crusade, actually, mistaken word there, rather unfortunate, to denaturalize, to de-scientize philosophy, to say, you know, that love is something that, but it's a sort of, it's like the ontological argument. It's sort of we pull ourselves out into reality as loving creatures.
Okay, well that's sort of a summary. But what I meant was, how could people sign up to any of your courses if they wanted to?
Ah, right. Well, they can go onto London School of Philosophy they can Google that, and then from there there are all sorts of ways they can. Can't remember them actually. How that they can
Google
sign up
London
for courses.
School of Philosophy, guys. Yes,
and my philosophy of love course is better than the rather sort of diffuse way that I spoke about it just now.
Okay.
And just to say that I'll be speaking at Blackwell's Bookshop in Oxford on the 11th of October, speaking about A Little History of Philosophy, which is published by Yale University Press.
Okay, and come and buy a book and get it signed by Nigel. Okay, I'm Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, which I urge you all to buy. And there's also a Philosophy Now forum, which you can go on if you go to the website, which is .org. My books are The Meta Revolution and Love, Solitude and Destruction. And next week we've got John Holroyd and his pupils talking about ethical issues.